Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Gesha Village Shaya 22056 wash processed Ethiopia from Junto Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Junto, based out of Taylors, South Carolina. And this coffee is our August 2023 Coffee of the Month, as it was voted on by you guys as the coffee you most wanted to see us review. And if the name of this coffee sounds familiar, then that's because we reviewed this same coffee from Mood Trap earlier this year, with Mood Trap's version of it being one of my favorite wash-processed Ethiopian coffees that we've ever reviewed on this channel. And that's the main reason why this coffee was suggested to us. So it'll be interesting to see how Junto's version of it compares, as this right here is day 37. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a higher extraction recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And this one I preferred through the Chemex, which typically indicates a more medium grind. However, with this one, we went a little bit more fine relative to that medium. Still medium, but slightly more fine than you might typically go for that brew method. Now, roast profile for this one, it is a little tricky as it's not quite as light as Mood Trap's version of this coffee. But Mood Trap's version was a very, very light coffee, and this one is still on the lighter side of things relative to a lot of other American coffee roasters. So that's to say that it's still a pretty light coffee by most standards and metrics, but maybe not to the uber light standards that Mood Trap roasts at. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 13, first impression, and we opted for the V60 with this one, and it definitely came out quite a bit delicate, and that's what we were kind of expecting going into it given our previous experiences with Junto's coffees, as it was mostly skewing in an herbal direction with a slight vegetal bitterness, indicating that it might need a little bit more time before we dive back into this coffee. It honestly just felt a little bit unbalanced, so overall it left just an okay first impression, not necessarily ideal. We continue on to day 16, opted for the Chemex, and this was definitely a bit better as there was a slightly sweet citric component reminiscent of the listed blood orange that they did have on here, also with this fresh fruit quality as well. Right off the top, there was this strong honeysuckle sense to it that slowly dissipates throughout, so as a result, a much better second impression, was definitely able to pull out a little bit more from this coffee. Continue on to day 19, opted for the April brewer, and this yielded mostly mixed results as it starts out slightly more delicate citric and a little bit of the listed melon notes that they did have on here before settling into more of that herbal coffee cherry-like aspect, as the more it cooled down, the more of this earthiness was present within the cup, as the herbal qualities are definitely felt in significant abundance with a slightly bitter light honey present in this cup as well. So some pretty mixed overall impressions from these first three tries, but we continue on to day 22. Opted for the V60 with a more fine grind and higher temperatures, and it continues to offer a tame cup with an emphasis on the slight herbal and vegetal aspects. And anytime I did brew it with the V60, that's the result I kept getting, was a little bit more of that vegetal herbal sort of component to it. Not particularly sweet or bright, with a slight floral bitterness as well as a subtle peachiness, this subtle fresh fruit component that can be felt kind of buried underneath what's a little bit more of this slightly bitter herbal vegetal cup. Day 25, through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and this is the best the cup had been to this point by a little bit of a distance, as it felt that this coffee was either improving with time or the higher extraction adjustments that we had made were starting to pay off, as this felt significantly more even. The finish is better as it does have that sugar cookie-like sweetness and a little bit more of this sweeter floral honey as well as citrus. Honeysuckle is once again the most pronounced thing right at the forefront of this cup, with a slight peach as well as just soft fresh fruit also present within the finish. So a much better cup here on day 25. Definitely one of the best experiences I'd had from this coffee. We continue on to day 28. Went with the V60 in the opposite direction. I said, what happens if we really kind of go significantly lower on the extraction? We'll see if maybe this by chance kind of tones down those really wild, savory, and herbal aspects to it. And that didn't necessarily help, as a more coarse grind and those lower temps continued to yield a more tame cup, with the floral honey continuing to be the most dominant attribute. More citrus, but there's that slightly herbal aspect. It didn't feel quite as bitter, so there were some trade-offs that in theory might have been worth it. But for me, it was still a little bit too tame of a cup, so not necessarily ideal with that brew method for that adjustment either. Day 31 did the exact same thing with the Chemex, and this definitely demonstrated that kind of making these adjustments didn't really help the coffee, as the honeysuckle was definitely still at the forefront. And that's what I really want to say about the Chemex, is the honeysuckle always seems to remain right there at the forefront right after this coffee has been brewed. But then right after that, it does go into one of two directions. And with the higher extraction, I was feeling a little bit more of those fruit components and a little bit more of that kind of florality in general. But with the lower extraction, I was feeling a more herbal bitterness. The tea-like aspects continued to feel very apt as it cooled off into a somewhat harsh and bitter sense. So that's definitely one of the reasons why I did prefer some higher temperatures, a little bit more fine of a grind on this one. Day 34, final notes we went back to that day 25 recipe, and once again, coffee is the best it has been up to this point, as I feel like that justified that specific recipe we had opted for, that specific method we had gone on for this coffee, as it continues to yield plenty of that soft sugar cookie-like aspect that was followed the honeysuckle-like aspect that was present right at the start. Plenty of these slightly bitter honey and herbal aspects, as well as a strong citric component, and plenty of those soft fruits as well, also present in the finish. So a lot of the things that we had mentioned, a little bit more even of a manner and a little bit more defined of a manner as well. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel. I don't have the tasting wheel pulled up. Let me pull up the tasting wheel, so you can see what we're getting. All right, and we have quite a few level 4s. So we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. And interestingly, I did waffle a little back and forth on the cleanliness for this one, because it actually isn't quite as clean as I might have expected, given that it is a wash processed Ethiopian Gesha. I feel like the amount of things that are kind of taking away from that, including that slightly harsh aspect to it, as well as the bitterness and the savory quality that's also present in it, didn't necessarily yield the most clean and defined profile. At the end of the day, I said it still is significantly more clean than a lot of the coffees that we do score at that level 3 mark. So it definitely at least justifies it in that sense, but it's not necessarily a true level 4, not quite as clean as I might have expected going into it. Finish, level 4. Yes, and this one right here, it actually is on the slightly higher side of level 4. There's that kind of long-lasting herbal and slight bitter aspect within this coffee. So while it did score that level 4, I can say that it's a little bit more prominent and pronounced than I might have expected, and it's one of those things where I think it only maybe would have reached a level 5 if this was a natural processed coffee and it had a little bit more heaviness to it, but it didn't quite have as much heaviness. Even then, pretty long lasting for a wash processed coffee. Plurality, level 4. Yes, and that's one of the most pronounced and defining aspects of this coffee, especially at the forefront. But the two things I noticed about this one was through the Chemex, I was experiencing so many more of those floral aspects to it, the honeysuckle most specifically. But in addition to that, that kind of just soft floral aspect that's present within it as well. And I don't know, level 4 does seem perfectly fitting for this one. If anything, it's actually probably my favorite part of this coffee. Citrus fruit, level 4, yes. And one of the first things I noticed was that blood orange, and that's possibly what it could be, because that at times has a little bit of a bitter quality to it. This coffee had a fair bit of bitterness to it in general. So speaking on that, that's the other floral component I was thinking of, that floral honey, that slightly more dark, bitter floral honey component to it. But the citrus being there at that level 4, yes, I would say that at times it's also slightly bitter. So that does justify that level 4 mark. Savoriness, level 4. Yes, I'm kind of surprised at how much of this kind of savory tea-like quality there is to it. They do have a white tea note listed on here, and I took a very prominent note of that because it just really seemed to yield a lot of those attributes. But in addition to that, a lot of coffees I've had in the past that have that sort of coffee cherry note listed on there also has that slight bitter component to it, and this one definitely had that. So that's another mark in terms of that level 4, but is also focusing on the bitterness of this one. Then we have a bunch of level 3s. We'll start with the sweetness level 3. Yes, that's obviously going to be one of the bigger sticking points for me, but that was also consistent with my previous experiences from Junto's other Ethiopian coffee, as it's not necessarily the most vibrant, wild, sweet coffee, and I don't know if that's necessarily what they're going for with their wash-processed Ethiopian coffees. But for me, sweetness is huge, one of the most important factors, so we always start the conversation for me enjoying a coffee having the sweetness at a level 4. So this one didn't quite have that, and one of the major sticking points for me. Acidity, level 3. Yes, that's kind of one of the other surprising things, and it's one of the things I took note of right at the start, as it came out a little less bright than I might have expected going into it. A lot of that, of course, being the roast profile, being a little bit on the lighter side of things. But given that the brightness was somewhat in the middle of that 3 to 4 range, I kind of bumped it down to a 3 because I said this doesn't necessarily offer the same sort of brightness that we typically associate with level 4 coffees. Saltiness, level 3. Yes, I'm kind of surprised at how salty this coffee is in general, and it's quite noticeable and something that I haven't necessarily discussed too much throughout this discussion so far. But it is something that did warrant and justify that level 3 mark, as well as those fruit components. So the berry fruit is the listed melon that they have on here, and then the stone fruit, that's slightly peachy quality to it. Those were also really nice, but they were hidden and they were only found through some significant adjustments with one specific brew method, as I didn't necessarily experience them as much through the V60. The Chemex really seemed to help kind of clear up the cup to justify a level 3 for both those marks, as they were subtle and in the background, but they were definitely both still present. Bitterness, level 3, yes, and the bitterness came in so many different directions. So a slightly bitter floral aspect, slightly bitter savory aspect, a slightly bitter herbal aspect, and a slightly bitter citric aspect. Even then, it did score at the level 3 because I feel like I've had more bitter coffees than this in that regard, but it's just kind of interesting to me how many different ways the bitterness was present within this coffee. Last thing worth discussing is the body at a level 2. I don't think that'll come as a surprise. Wash processed Ethiopian Gesha. Through the Chemex, it was always going to be on the lighter side of the body, but as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think that it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, let's get this out of the way. If we're comparing it alongside of the Mood Trap version, then I had a very strong preference towards the Mood Trap version, but the Mood Trap version was definitely much more my type of coffee, as it offered a bit more of a cleaner base, a sweeter profile to it, more florals, as well as a better defined fruit profile to it. So this one didn't necessarily have all of those things. This one, I feel like might have been on me because I really seem to struggle with this coffee, and I've had the same issues with the 3 Junto coffees that we've reviewed on this channel. No other coffee roaster I've ever reviewed do I have coffees choke up as much as I do with Junto's coffees. So it's pretty much every single brew I've ever done with their coffees always seems to choke up. And honestly, it's the only coffee roaster that I've ever had that sort of experience with. So they're kind of tricky to brew with in general. And there were some really noticeable differences based off even some small adjustments to this coffee. So this coffee in general was slightly inconsistent. And at the same time, it offered a lot of things that I wasn't expecting from it. Those previous experiences we had with Junto's coffees kind of yielded similar results, as they at times can feel a little uneven and a little all over the board. So I want to chalk this one up to me and say I kind of just struggled with it and I couldn't figure out the best of this coffee. What I kind of settled on was the best experiences I had had from it through a lot of tinkering and a lot of adjustments. So that's to basically say I don't really know what to make of this one. It didn't necessarily turn out as I was expecting, but that's just kind of been my experiences overall with this coffee roaster. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I think the first place I want to start is maybe a little bit more of this kind of like bitter aspect to it, because it's something that I noticed throughout. Specifically, the herbal bitterness is the first direction I want to point somebody towards, because it was slightly vegetal, it was slightly earthy, and if you can kind of enjoy that from the V60, then that might be the first place to start. But outside of that, it does offer some really nice things. The florals in this one are really nice. If you're able to maybe accentuate and pull out a little bit more of those soft fruit components, then that could be another really nice thing. But in addition to that, keep in mind the citric quality to it, because as I kind of mentioned, there's a citric bitterness that's also present within this one. So that's kind of one of those things I really want to focus on, because if you enjoyed those aspects, then this one would be a pretty good fit. But I feel like that's the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Gesha Village Shaya 22056 wash processed Ethiopia from Junto Coffee. Thank you for watching.